Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this discussion. It's a pretty important discussion, and it's related to biology and behavior. Now, the reason we are talking about this in this context is that it relates to previous conversations that we've had related to science, history, law, biology, and religion. And so we're going to tie a few things together here when we talk about biology versus behavior. There is a belief that many people have that everyone is equally at risk for catching transmissible diseases, that everyone has an equal risk of becoming ill and suffering from mortality. And so that's not the case. And so many of you probably have guessed that, but that is definitely not the case. And there are a number of dynamics that fuel transmission, acquisition, and illness. And where many people think that the issue is behavior, oftentimes, in many instances, the issue is really about biology. But the issue of biology becomes obscured because there is so much focus on behavior. And so we're going to be looking at why there are these variations, and we're going to be looking at something specific known as CCR5. And we're going to be looking at what happens when CCR5 presents in one way versus in another way. In other words, a mutation. Because there is also what has been noted as a correlation, a high correlation, between various histories and these rises in contagious diseases. And you also have a correlation between these rises of diseases and battles for succession in more recent history, and these power grabs and land grabs. And so in many instances, there have been suggestions that historically germs have been used as a warfare method. And when germs are used in warfare, what you end up having is the ability of the aggressor to throw rocks and then hide their hands. And so we are going to look at some questions about this as we look at this dynamic of biology versus behavior. So we're going to jump into this discussion about disease and demography and the role of race in quotation marks in history. So let's just jump into what this hypothesis is all about. There is a scientific belief that a discrete group of Europeans have an increase in general disease immunity. And so therefore they are basically immune to a number of diseases that other groups of people are not immune to and are highly susceptible to. And what's odd about the susceptibility and the immunity is that as you go up in Europe and you go up into Northern Europe, the belief is that the immunity increases. You find more people with this immunity the higher up you go in Europe. And the closer you get to the southern part of Europe, the less immunity that you actually have. And you will also see that for the most part, this mutation that provides this immunity is fairly absent in certain groups of people, really generally speaking. So across Africa, across Asia, in terms of the indigenous American people, you do not see this immunity in the numbers that you see it in Northern Europeans. And it's about a 10% rate in terms of this sort of almost total immunity to a number of diseases. There are some other things that come along with having this mutation, but many of the diseases that people struggle with today, particularly in the United States, there is an immunity for a large number of people that come from certain areas in Europe. Now, of course, this doesn't include everyone in Europe, and so therefore it's not race the way that you typically think about race. This is really at a genetic level. Historically, there used to be a belief in the scientific community that the immunity, the mutation, was an outgrowth of the plague. However, more recently, there are assertions that the immunity is an outgrowth of smallpox. And so the belief is that individuals historically suffered from smallpox, were exposed to smallpox, and then their descendants benefited or now benefit from a mutation growing out of selective pressure related to smallpox. And again, there is a high correlation between these diseases, the plague, smallpox, and battles for succession, whether you were talking about the battles for succession in Europe, or whether you were talking about the battles for succession in Africa, whether you were talking about battles in Asia, and even battles in America, where you have these histories of land grab dynamics. You also have histories of people being destroyed based upon these germ spreads. While there has been a recent report about monkeypox being brought into the United States, there is still the belief that smallpox is a large bioterror threat, and that this threat is persistent even though it is believed to be eradicated. It's not completely eradicated, of course, because you still have samples of it. And so it's indicated that in 2001, efforts were began in order to prepare hospitals and cities in the event that a smallpox bioterror event takes place. And so there has also been research on the clinical features of smallpox, the pathology of smallpox, how you can prevent smallpox, how you can treat it, and the history of it to get a better understanding of how to handle it in the event that it does present itself. And this website provides a very helpful timeline so that you can think historically in terms of smallpox. Now you have some other germ dynamics going on during some of the same time, because you also have the plague and the Black Death going on at the exact same time. So interspersed in here. But you see this spread, purported spread from the east to the west in terms of smallpox, and you also see that it is definitely related to colonization, imperialism, commerce, slavery. So you see all of these negative things that are related to smallpox. And so you see in the 6th century, it's noted that increased trade with China and Korea brings smallpox to Japan. 7th century, Arab expansion spread smallpox into northern Africa, Spain, and Portugal. 11th century, Crusades further spread smallpox into Europe. 15th century, Portugal occupies part of Western Europe, bringing smallpox with them. Now, mind you, the Portuguese are traveling all over the place at the same time. And so it's not clear that, for instance, that the Chinese and the Koreans spread the smallpox to Japan, because you have individuals in different parts of the world traveling at different times. But this is the scenario that is painted based upon this timeline here. And so again, you have Portugal occupies part of Western Africa, bringing smallpox. This is also the time that Portugal, Spain was traveling into the Americas. And so you also have here 16th century European settlers and the African slave trade import smallpox into the Caribbean, Central America, and South America. It's important to note that even though Europeans look the way they look today for the most part, Europeans didn't look the way they look today back then. So there was a bit more diversity going on. And so it's not clear who exactly was spreading the smallpox or bringing smallpox with them. Was it one phenotype or another phenotype? But it is important to remember that those who were occupying Europe at these times didn't necessarily look like they look today. So you have to keep that in mind when you were looking at this spread. Who were these people actually spreading smallpox? Okay, so then you have 17th century European settlers bring smallpox to North America. Then you have 18th century explorers from Great Britain bring smallpox to Australia. Now, common sense would suggest if there is a disease process going on in one place, that those individuals would sit themselves down and not go around spreading it to other places. However, you see that that is not the case. You see that's not the case in this situation when you look at this timeline, and you see that going on today. So you see people with this current situation opening their borders wide open so that everyone can come in to increase commerce. And so the focus is on commerce or whatever it's on, and less attention paid to eradicating whatever is going on, or just sitting down for a moment until things perhaps just sort of slow down on their own. So let's move right along here. So we are going to quickly look at some science related to this issue, and this is coming out of the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences of the United States of America. And so this is our National Academy of Sciences. What this particular article is looking at is evaluating plague and smallpox as historical selective pressures for this CCR5 mutation and the HIV resistance that it apparently confers for many people. And so we're going to be looking at some of the dynamics related to this odd immunity that is conferred upon a number of people. And it's with respect to this allele. And an allele is just one or two alternative forms of a gene. So you have a gene, however, the gene doesn't look the same in terms of its physiology in every person. And so there is a standard, and then you have this mutation. And so something is missing with respect to this mutation. And this mutation is found on the same place on a chromosome where you would find the normal feature. And this is just to give you a basic idea of this mutation. And so when individuals actually have an appropriate normal CCR5, that would be considered the plus. But what's odd about that is that it has a place for insertion. And so when you were talking about proteins, the GP protein, the spike protein, you see this little V that is cut out there. That V basically represents the space in which the protein can insert itself. And so those individuals who have the normal copies, this is what theirs looks like. Basically, this of course isn't the same thing, but this is to make it easy to look at and understand. And so you see that, so you have this lock and key dynamic. And so this would be the lock, and then the microbe would serve as the key. And then on the right hand side, you see basically the same chromosome. However, the opening is missing. And so that missing opening is what confers resistance, because there's nowhere for the microbe to enter. And so you have individuals who are genetically set up to be resistant because they have a boundary where the boundary doesn't exist with the other individuals that would be on the left-hand side. The color coding is there because there seems to be some relationship when you do that whole North Europe down to Southern Europe. There seems to be some sort of relationship perhaps between melanin and a history of ancestry that involves a significant amount of melanin perhaps, and either the mutation or the normal situation. And so those who tend to be darker tend to have more susceptibility. Those who are lighter and up in the northern portions of Europe they have less susceptibility. Now, this isn't for everyone, every single person who's in Northern Europe or every single person who is below that. But what you have is this high prevalence with individuals who are in certain parts of Europe and have certain ancestry. Those individuals are just genetically wired at this point to resist a number of diseases. Now, as you can imagine, this sets a potential stage for some uh, foolishness with respect to bioweapons, bioterror, and a number of other dynamics. These researchers came to their conclusions based upon what they noted as a high frequency, recent origin of this mutation, this very specific geographic distribution of this mutation, together with this intense selection for Europe. They take all of that together along with the fact that HIV has not existed in the human population for very long to account for this dynamic. They take all of this together to rule out actually the bubonic plague and rule in smallpox as the more consistent dynamic that would have perhaps brought about this particular mutation. And this is when we get to that behavior versus biology dynamic, because there has been a history of pushing the narrative that HIV is all about behavior. It is about behavior in some instances, but not necessarily about behavior in other instances. In other words, even if two people engage in the same behavior, but two people have different genetic makeups, the two people are not at the same risk for contracting HIV or SARS or a number of other disease dynamics that are related to this CCR5. And so with respect to HIV, because that's where the research really blossomed in terms of this CCR5 understanding, CCR5 does confer resistance to HIV in many instances. And so if an individual has one copy of CCR5, they'll have sort of a partial resistance or a slower disease progression. But if they are completely deleted in terms of this CCR5, the mutation is complete, then these individuals are basically completely resistant to HIV. So that's not about behavior, that's about biology. Same thing goes with SARS-CoV and a number of other diseases that people have been led to believe are completely related to their behaviors. And so there's a little bit more going on there than just behavior. And here the researchers offer additional explanation regarding their thinking. And what they are indicating is that HIV has not infected human beings long enough to account for this allele. So this resistance cannot be attributed directly to HIV is what they are asserting. And they are also indicating that on average about 10% of European populations have this resistance. They've also noted that this allele, this mutation, is virtually absent. We talked about this in African populations, Asian populations, Middle Easterns, and American Indian populations. And so therefore they are also saying this appears to be giving some credence to the idea that this is of recent origin. This is not old genetic stuff. And so they are often looking at this issue of this 700-year time frame. And they are also looking at the fact that the plague in and of itself could not bring about this dynamic. And they are looking at the history, they are looking at the patterns of it, and then the time frame. Now, although there is a ruling out of the infamous Black Death, as they have indicated here, there is also a possibility that there is a relationship still between the bubonic plague, this Black Death, and smallpox. And you also have this indication about the Great Plague that killed 15 to 20% of Europe's population. It would be interesting to get a better understanding of who was killed by the Great Plague during this time frame, because again, these time frames are completely related to these battles for succession. And you do know that there was an ethnic cleansing dynamic going on in Western Europe. And so you have a number of dynamics here which bring about a number of questions, but you do see this relationship between these plagues and smallpox. And so you see here where it indicates that the plague declined in Europe around the 1700s there. And then you also see this disappearance of the plague around 1750. This completely ties together with the battles for succession. And so interestingly, when the people that perhaps created the need for the battle for succession were gone, then you have these diseases subsiding. And so you also see the another pandemic that's mentioned, the 1665 through 1666 pandemic that also took place in Europe. So you had a number of pandemics that were popping up during these battles for succession, during these land grabs. And so it looks like pandemics might actually go hand in hand with land grabs. Pandemics may go hand in hand with ethnic cleansing dynamics. And so pandemics do not appear to exist in and of themselves. There seems to be some sort of geopolitical dynamic that goes along with all of these pandemics that have taken place, at least in recent history. So when you look at over the last at least 700 years or so, there does appear to be power dynamics related to these pandemics. The researchers point out a number of things with respect to transmission when they are doing this comparison and contrasting with smallpox and the plagues. And one thing that they point out is that in contrast to the plague, where you've got rats and fleas involved in the whole transmission process, with respect to smallpox, you have direct human to human transmission. And so it's this continuous transmission process. And then you also have this dynamic where when you have these epidemics, you have children who then become the naive populations in terms of they haven't been touched by this particular disease state. And so they would be the only ones in the population that had no exposure to it. And so that's how it became in the past known as a childhood disease. However, you also have this interesting process going on with the plagues. And so with the plagues, you had these high fatality rates, but with respect to smallpox, you had a fatality rate of about 30%. In some instances, it's a little bit more. And so you have smallpox being represented as being more continuous, whereas the other ones were not as continuous. Again, smallpox didn't require any mediation. It was a direct transmission dynamic. They go on to talk about how the plague could not have brought about this high level of resistance. And then they mention the 400-year period of plague epidemics in Europe did not remove enough individuals of high reproductive potential to generate a sufficient selection coefficient. And there we have that 400-year period again. There's something apparently very special about 400 years because you have 400 years related to slavery. You have 400 years that they are discussing here. You have right now, this is the 400-year anniversary period for the introduction of smallpox to the American Indians. And so 400 years is apparently a very important number. And so what they are basically saying is that all things considered, the only thing that could have brought about this selective pressure for this mutation would have been smallpox. Now, that's not to say that that is the end all be all, because again, you have these diseases that are correlated with each other. So they are not just correlated with battles for succession, they are correlated with each other. They are coexisting. And so it's not completely clear that they are not impacting each other in order to bring about this entire dynamic. Now, what's interesting is that you have recent discussions about smallpox being used as a bioterror weapon. Again, what you have here with smallpox is this resistance. And so you have a large number of individuals of European descent who are basically immune to smallpox. And so even their children, if they have not been impacted by it, they would be genetically immune because of this mutation. And so if smallpox were to rear its head again, smallpox would not impact all people in the same way. And so regardless of behavior, some people would be more vulnerable to smallpox than other groups of people. And so you can see why this creates quite a problem in terms of bad behaviors and bad actors. What has been offered, however, is that individuals might actually voluntarily engage in this mutation process in order to bring about this resistance. Now, of course, some people might think that that's a great idea. The issue, however, is that that's not the natural state of that person's human body. And so it's unclear why God put that there, even though it appears to be presenting a problem in some instances. It's apparently there for a reason. However, there is this offering that in order to have this resistance, that individuals might opt for this mutation. And you can also look it up. There's research on 2 babies that this was performed on in terms of creating this deletion, creating this mutation. It's unclear how the babies are doing now, but that research was carried out. There was quite a bit of criticism related to this research. However, that research is going forward. As we wrap this up, we're going to touch on the issue of the potential for scientific racism growing out of this whole dynamic. So we've looked at biology versus behavior. We have basically put science, religion, history, all of that on trial in looking at this particular situation. And so what you know now is that not everyone is equally at risk for catching transmissible diseases. Not everyone is at risk for becoming ill. Not everyone is at risk for mortality. What you also see here, because you know of that phrase now, asymptomatic carrier, what you also know based upon this is, when you extrapolate from this, is that you have individuals who are also potentially super spreaders. And so if an individual does not have what would be considered standard signs and symptoms of a disease state that is transmissible, those individuals are at higher than average risk, perhaps for spreading things, because they have no idea that they even have the things that are spreading, because they are just carrying these things without having the manifestations of an actual infection. And so that's something else to consider in this entire dynamic. You also have this better understanding, hopefully, of the relationship between history and these disease dynamics and how they do correlate with power grabs. They correlate with battles for succession and land grabs. And so we have looked at how germs actually are used or can be used or have been accused of being used for warfare, and in a way that allows the thrower of the rock to hide their hand. Now, one of the concerning things about this that's emerging is that there is an assertion by some researchers that those individuals with the mutation are smarter than individuals who have the normal situation. They are purporting that individuals with the mutation have better memory, they learn more, that they are just cognitively superior. And because this mutation is related to, in general terms, a specific phenotype, it brings up a number of questions. What is that research all about? What are they really asserting? And what are they trying to communicate with what definitely appears to be scientific racism? And so it's not clear completely all of the things that they are using to come up with this higher IQ with respect to this mutation. But that is what is being asserted. And so you want to be on the lookout for that because there are a lot of messages that are contained in that the individuals, less melanated individuals, are smarter individuals, are better individuals, are more disease resistant. You have a number of underlying constructs that are going on with this, and then indicating that those who are of African descent, Asian descent, American Indian, that those individuals are somehow biologically inferior because they have the normal mechanisms going on. So it's a very weird science that's going on there, and it's unclear what even brought about this need to test such a theory. Remember, knowledge is power. Take care. See you soon.